Opportunity to discuss some of the issues related with economic cooperation to counter the economic impact of the COVID in ASEAN. I will look at economic impact broadly in terms of its impact on growth, then what countries have done to counter the negative impact, why ASEAN should work more closely together in terms of economic cooperation, what are some of the initiatives, and the longer term issues. May I have the next slide, please, Dr. Adil? Okay, Prof. Titinan has also alluded to the economic impact of the COVID. He has talked about the economic impact in terms of its impact on the growth, and that this impact will actually be seen later in the year rather than earlier in the year. So in the growth forecast that we have for the ASEAN, we can see that the growth forecast has changed progressively over time, and it has become more pessimistic. So for example, we can see that for Singapore, it has been revised downwards to -3.5% in June, for Thailand to -6.7%, for Malaysia too. And we will see further revisions of these numbers as we move to the second half of the year, because as Prof. Titinan has said, the impact will emerge more clearly in the second half of the year. Whether we will be able to recover from this by next year will depend very much on the policy actions that are being taken by each country this year in terms of the fiscal stimulus, in terms of the ability to control the spread of the pandemic and its resurgence in each country. But by and large, if you look at the growth forecast, at least 5 countries will go negative. The CLMV countries seem to fare better than the older ASEAN countries. Next slide, please. If we look at the initiatives that have been undertaken in each country, is mainly the use of fiscal stimulus. Of course, the amount that each country can afford to spend to stimulate the economy depends on the initial GDP of the country. So we find that, for example, Indonesia is planning to spend 4.2% of its GDP. Malaysia will be spending about also 4.2% of its GDP in terms of fiscal stimulus. Next slide, please. Countries which are wealthier are more prepared to spend more. Singapore, for example, up to almost 20% of its GDP. Thailand is also quite generous, up to 9.6% of the GDP. Now, this fiscal stimulus will be difficult to sustain because the countries are mostly in fiscal deficit already, and the large amount of money that is being used to stimulate the economy means that the public debt of the country will increase. Next slide, please. So we can see, for example, the public debt in the countries with fiscal deficit, as shown in this slide, will be increasing from 2019 to 2020, and therefore the fiscal stimulus cannot continue indefinitely. Because of this, the countries cannot just depend on domestic initiatives alone, but will have to fall back on the region. As Prof. Titinan has said, the larger AMS, ASEAN member states with large domestic markets are less dependent on the external sector. But for the smaller economies like Singapore, Malaysia, which are hugely dependent on the external, the economic cooperation and the regional market is actually very important. May I have the next slide, please? So when we talk about ASEAN economic cooperation, this is the economic cooperation, the issues which have come up in terms of the COVID is actually increasing protectionism. And the protectionism has taken the form of export bans or restrictions on exports, especially on essential medical products. So in the table that I show in this slide, for example, we can see that countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines have actually put export ban or restrictions on the export of masks. Of course, these restrictions have been lifted over time. But I am encouraged that the ASEAN +3 Economic Ministers Joint Statement on mitigating the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on 4th June has reaffirmed the importance of keeping markets open for trade and investment, and to refrain from taking unnecessary measures that may affect the smooth flow of essential goods, such as food, medicine, and medical supplies. So there's the agreement that for essential medical products, the ASEAN will refrain from using export bans or restrictions. Of particular importance would be food and food security. Next slide, please. Because we know that in terms of food security, imports play a very important role. For countries that are not able to have sufficient agricultural goods to meet their domestic demand, import is a very important source. And therefore, export bans on food will be hugely restrictive to countries which are dependent on the import of food to maintain food security. So we take, for example, rice, which is essential for all ASEAN member states. There was actually rice export ban, and many countries actually demonstrated panic buying. You can see in the picture shown here, people buying bags of rice because they were afraid that they would not have enough rice to buy during the MCO, the restrictions in the control movement. Of course, over time, there are also import tariff relief, allowing countries to buy more as they need. To avoid pandemic-related trade restrictions, and countries have actually lifted their export limits. Next slide, please. On food security, we also have the ASEAN +3 Emergency Rice Reserve, which is to overcome possible food shortages and to help food security during emergencies. It was established in 2011, and we have all these rice reserves to help countries out during times of emergency where they can draw down on the stockpile. Next slide, please. Oh, next, please. For enhancing regional trade and economic cooperation, a very important agreement is that in the ASEAN +3 joint statement is that ASEAN will remain committed to the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in 2020 and working together to resolve India's outstanding issues in a mutually satisfactory way. So the RCEP is actually a very important incoming agreement, as pointed out by Prof. Titinan, that because of the weakening of multilateralism, regional initiatives have become very important. In the case of ASEAN, it is actually really important because it will hold together all the +3 agreements that we have. In the next slide, please. We know that in the ASEAN 2015 and the 2025 vision, ASEAN's vision is not just to be integrated within ASEAN, but it's to remain integrated with the global economy. So on the left side of the slide, we can see in the 2015 vision to be fully integrated to the global economy. On the right side in the 2025, there's still this pillar retained under global ASEAN. Next slide, please. So we have actually, as of now, the two important agreements is the TPP-11 and the RCEP. TPP-11, even after the United States have withdrawn, remains a very important agreement because of the nature of the agreement. And the RCEP, even without India, remains an important agreement because although India is big in terms of its population, it's small in terms of its share of the GDP in the RCEP, about 10%. Next slide, please. So the RCEP scale actually far exceeds that of the TPP-11 that was with India in it, but without India, it still remains significant. Of course, it is hoped that India will rejoin, but that remains to be seen. Next slide. The scope of the RCEP, if we were to compare it with the TPP-11, of course, is more restrictive. There are less chapters. Nevertheless, it covers trade liberalization in goods. It also covers trade in services, investment, the 3 pillars for liberalization. It has also a chapter on the movement of natural persons. So if we're talking about people movement, in this RCEP, the movement of natural persons refers to the movement of skilled labor, as in the economic pillar. So we are talking about skilled workers, not the unskilled category that we see in the cross-border flows. We also have actually important chapters that will help in terms of building up SMEs, and also in terms of electronic commerce. We have a chapter on that, which is quite new, and there's also a chapter on government procurement. So with the signing of the RCEP in 2020, it would be a big step forward to show that the region is still together, hanging in together, and the region is still advancing forward in terms of trade and investment liberalization. And this will also nicely tie up all the ASEAN Plus agreements that we have. And now I come to my last slide. I agree with Prof. Titinan that ASEAN, more than ever before, in the COVID times, even before COVID times, ASEAN has faced many external challenges, trade conflicts, threats from terrorism, cybersecurity, climate change, geopolitical shifts, anti-globalization sentiments. Nevertheless, it is true that in ASEAN, more than before, united we will stand, divided we will fall. Therefore, ASEAN needs to focus on being united, use this opportunity to enhance cooperation, retain its coherence as a regional community, and focus on the objective of building the ASEAN community, especially the ASEAN economic community. Thank you very much, Prof. Johan, for this time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was very, very comprehensive from you, Siew, like I call it. Yeah. Go personal with you. I personally like the part at the end where you mentioned the importance of the the new multilateral economic arrangements, the RCEP, for example, in the light of as Titina pointed out, the U.S. China rivalry, we saw the what do you call it, the debunking of the TPP, right? And as a result, now we have other opportunities to also engage, as Titinan pointed out, with the some of the groups of countries, and I think the RCEP is a very good example. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you in terms of the economic issues that are clearly very grave and very important in terms of the challenges that will be faced by the ASEAN countries, given negative growth, as you pointed out, at least five countries will be facing, that kind of problem. And ASEAN countries, as we all know, are very externally oriented. So they depend very much on international trade, on investment, and so on. So the COVID situation certainly puts a brake on some of these opportunities for the ASEAN countries in terms of expanding their economies or improving their developmental trajectories. So I think, thank you very much.